Welcome to This Explainer. When most of us picture ancient Rome, we usually imagine the city bathed in brilliant Mediterranean sunlight. We picture these gleaming white marble statues, orderly forums, basically the absolute pinnacle of civilizational achievement. But to really understand what it was like for ordinary Romans, we have to kind of strip all that pristine marble away. We're going to plunge straight into the gritty, sensory reality of the ancient world. So we aren't going to be talking about emperors walking around in the daylight. Instead, we're reconstructing an entire human world of survival, fear, and resilience. We are stepping right into the suffocating smells, the deafening noise, and the deep, deep shadows of the city when the sun went down. Okay, let's dive into this. What actually happened the moment the sun dipped below the horizon? Well, that illusion of imperial order, it completely vanished. Rome transformed into this incredibly dangerous, highly contested domain. But to really wrap our heads around the terror and chaos of the Roman night, we first need to understand the extreme, almost shocking pragmatism of the Roman day. Because during the day, absolutely nothing went to waste, and survival literally meant using every available resource, no matter how foul it might seem to us today. Like, if you were just walking the streets of Rome during the day, the sensory shock would hit you immediately. I'm talking about human waste. To the Romans, this wasn't just garbage. It was a highly organized, super valuable commodity that kept the whole economy running. When urine is left to decompose, it turns into ammonia. So laborers in commercial laundries, called fulleries, would literally jump up and down in giant vats of urine just to dissolve grease from people's togas. And it didn't stop there. Feces and urine were actively traded. They were used to fertilize agricultural fields, grow juicier pomegranates, cure sick sheep and sick bees, even soften raw leather hides in the tanneries. The daylight economy was just a masterclass in brutal, unglamorous efficiency. There was actually a massive, heavily organized trade in all this waste. It was gathered directly from latrines by specialized laborers called stercorari. And get this, it was such a lucrative industry that Emperor Vespasian actually slapped a tax on urine. Yeah, a urine tax. When his son Titus was totally disgusted by the idea of taxing something so gross, Vespasian just held up a coin and dropped this legendary line: pecunia non olet, money doesn't stink. That extreme, unsentimental pragmatism, that was the absolute bedrock of the Roman mindset. Now, this intense daytime economy was super tightly regulated. Julius Caesar had actually banned most wheeled traffic during daylight hours, mostly just to ease the crazy congestion in the urban center. So think about what happens the moment dusk arrives and those restrictions are suddenly lifted. The city just erupted. Imagine this sudden, deafening rush of heavy wooden carts, whips cracking, and iron-shod horse hooves just racing over these deeply uneven paving stones. The noise was so relentless that writers back then actually complained it was literally killing people from sheer lack of sleep. And as this incredibly dangerous, chaotic traffic just flooded the streets, ordinary laborers had to find somewhere to go. Keep in mind, the vast majority of Rome's lower-class residents lived in these super cramped, fire-prone apartment blocks called insulae. And these apartments, they didn't even have kitchens. So if you wanted a hot meal, you couldn't just cook at home. You had to venture out into the grimy hospitality industry. Maybe you'd grab a quick bite from a takeaway snack booth called a thermopolium. Or if you have a little more cash, you might sit down in a capona. But for slaves and the poorest citizens, the low-class popinae were really the only option to get a cheap cup of wine, some bread, chickpeas, and maybe play a quick dice game. So twilight really brought out this stark, inescapable class divide. As night closed in, the wealthy elites would retreat into their heavily guarded, totally luxurious private villas. They're having elaborate banquets, multi-course feasts, poetry readings, the whole shebang. But for the masses, reality was vastly different. Ordinary Romans were crowding into places like Asalina's Tavern in Pompeii, just standing elbow to elbow at these L-shaped masonry counters. It was their way of escaping those cramped, unlit apartments to find a little warmth, some socialization, and just a temporary break from the brutal labor of the day. But as total darkness fell, this brand new atmospheric terror set in. Massive environmental pollution. Back then, your wealth literally dictated the air you breathed. While the elite were heating their spacious homes with clean-burning charcoal braziers, the impoverished folks packed into those tight insulae had to rely on open braziers burning dried manure. Yeah, dried manure. And they used these cheap, greasy tallow candles for light. So as the daytime heat finally subsided, these thick, suffocating clouds of soot and grease just hung low over the densely populated neighborhoods. It created this deeply claustrophobic, literally choking environment for the urban poor. And honestly, once you stepped out of those smoky taverns into the pitch-black streets, you were literally taking your life into your hands. The Roman poet Juvenal really hit the nail on the head when he said, "Anyone venturing out after dinner without making a will is a fool." And he wasn't exaggerating. The physical streets at night were a death trap. The paving stones were worn down and totally uneven. There were these high stone curbs meant to divert raw sewage that you just couldn't see in the dark. Plus, unsecured loose bricks and roof tiles from daytime construction projects would routinely slip from upper stories, just silently falling through the darkness to crush pedestrians right below. But incredibly, falling bricks were actually the least of your worries. The unlit streets were an absolute haven for the lawless. Let me be perfectly clear. There were 0 municipal streetlights. None. If you didn't have the money to hire slaves to carry torches for you, you were walking completely blind. And this darkness was the perfect shield for violent crime. You had Roman gangs of young, aristocratic men basically looking for defenseless victims to beat up for fun. It was this twisted, transgressive practice they called slumming. Even emperors, guys like Nero and Otho, were known to disguise themselves in coarse cloaks, sneak down into the rough entertainment districts, and brutally assault innocent people just for kicks. Crazy, right? So the onset of darkness imposed this profound barrier that totally divided the Roman populace. Basically, how you dealt with nocturnal boredom was the ultimate marker of your class. The elite used the quiet hours for something they called lucubratio, this highly virtuous late-night study, philosophy, and writing by lamplight, usually while lounging on these complex, elevated ivory beds. But the illiterate laborers, they were barred from intellectual pursuits and totally lacked the funds for lamp oil. So they were either driven into those rowdy, violent tavern brawls, or they were forced into inactive, fearful confinement in their pitch-black rooms, basically just holding their breath and waiting for the sun to come up. But the darkness wasn't just for criminals and terrified laborers. It also provided the perfect cover for subversive, exclusive rituals, completely hidden from the male-dominated Roman state. For example, every year on December 3rd, they held the nocturnal rites of Bona Dea, the good goddess. This was hosted by the wife of a prominent senator and overseen by the Vestals, and it was a strictly female-exclusive event. It involved devotional libations of wine, sacrifices, you name it. The night essentially suspended the rigid, patriarchal order of the daylight hours, creating this profound, hidden world right in the middle of the city. Although, the sheer exclusivity of the night sometimes proved a little too tempting. In 62 BCE, this massive political scandal erupted when a young patrician named Clodius Pulcher actually tried to infiltrate those sacred Bona Dea rituals. How? By disguising himself in women's clothing. Obviously, he was discovered, and it led to this highly publicized, absolutely scandalous trial where the famous orator Cicero actually argued for his guilt. It perfectly illustrates how the shadows of the Roman night could temporarily turn strict social and gender rules completely upside down, turning the city into a literal theater of political transgression. So you've got pitch-black streets, falling roof tiles, aristocratic street gangs, and the terrifying, constant threat of a single knocked-over oil lamp burning down entire wooden neighborhoods. How on earth did the state respond to all this? Well, Emperor Augustus finally realized this extreme municipal vulnerability was totally unsustainable. So, in 6 CE, he rolled out a sweeping reform. He recruited a massive, dedicated night watch of 7,000 men just to tame the nocturnal chaos. These guys were called the Vigiles Urbani, affectionately, and honestly, maybe a little mockingly, known as the Little Bucket Fellows. Now, it is absolutely crucial to understand that these were not highly respected military soldiers like the Praetorian Guard, not at all. The Vigilists were recruited from the absolute most marginalized sectors of Roman society, freedmen and public slaves. The paradox here is just striking. The safety of the sleeping, wealthy elite relied entirely on the labor of the most marginalized people. They were tasked with this incredibly dangerous, highly stigmatized municipal duty, literally patrolling the grimiest, most hazardous corners of the empire. A single night in the life of a Vigils was absolutely brutal. They were divided up into 7 cohorts, patrolling Rome's 14 districts. Their number one job was fire prevention. And let me tell you, their authority was absolute. If they caught a citizen being careless with fire in their own home, the Vigils could and would punish them right then and there with a birch rod or a whip. They also functioned as a rough police force, apprehending thieves in the dark, capturing runaway slaves, breaking up those rowdy tavern brawls we talked about, and eventually standing guard over the massive public bath that stayed open late into the night. But here's the real question. How do you incentivize marginalized laborers and former slaves to risk their lives every single night, fighting catastrophic fires and brawling in pitch-black alleys? Well, the Roman state offered the ultimate prize: Through the Lex Visalia in 24 AD, any vigil who survived and completed years of active service, which was initially 6 years, later reduced to 3, was granted full Roman citizenship. It was a perilous, fiery path to upward mobility, literally forged in the total darkness of the ancient city. So a really profound civilizational perspective starts to emerge from the shadows here. Rome wasn't just one singular, uniform city. It was two entirely distinct realities. By day, it was this aristocratic space of orderly forums and pristine marble temples. But when the sun went down, that grand facade just dissolved into a deeply unequal, highly hazardous fight for survival. The Roman night reveals the deep contradictions of their entire world, the immense wealth insulated in private villas versus the sheer resilience of the vulnerable masses huddled in smoky taverns, guarded by former slaves armed with nothing but little buckets. We tend to romanticize the past a lot, right? We imagine ourselves philosophizing on ivory beds or attending these grand multi-course banquets. But history shows us that the vast majority of human experience was lived right down in the shadows, navigating the choking smoke, the deafening carts, and the lawless alleys just to survive to see another dawn. So, knowing what you know now about the environmental hazards, the violent gangs, and the stark inequalities of the ancient world, if you were stripped of your modern comforts and dropped straight into those unlit streets, would you have survived the Roman night?